Well, to talk a little more about this subject, I'm joined now on the line from London by Christopher Sabatini, who is a senior research fellow for Latin America on the US and Americas program at Chatham House think tank in London. First of all, welcome to the program, Mr. Sabatini. Thank you so much for your time. We do appreciate it. Maybe first of all, I could begin by asking you, Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro says this is all about engineering regime change in his country. Is he right?
Yes, quite frankly, he is. He is also engaged in illicit arms trafficking and money laundering and cocaine trafficking. But the truth is he's correct on this. There's no reason, first of all, why the U.S. would be so concerned with drug traffickers leaving Venezuela. First of all, Venezuelan, the cocaine that transits through Venezuela doesn't produce it, but the cocaine that transits through Venezuela only represents about 5% of the cocaine that enters the U.S. Cocaine also, Venezuela doesn't produce fentanyl. That is produced in Mexico, although Trump alleges that these boats are carrying fentanyl. That's simply untrue. It doesn't produce fentanyl. The real reason here is the hope that they can dislodge Maduro from power, and maybe some of his cronies as well, to stage a more pro-U.S. government that is less engaged in illicit activities, that is more democratic, and that can open up the country for investment. So that's what this is really about. And the hope is, by this dramatic show of force, and it escalates, it's been going on since late August until now, and now with the arrival of the USS Gerald R, the hope is that they will scare the military into removing Maduro or pressuring him into going to exile, and they can have a sort of a regime change on the cheap. As you mentioned in your report, Donald Trump has said he doesn't plan to go to war with Venezuela. They're hoping to do this without actually bringing any sort of force on land to do that. But this escalation does lead us to wonder, if that doesn't work, what will come next?
And do you think it is likely to work? Maduro is saying he's organized a huge military operation to counterattack. Would Venezuelans fight? They would know they would have very little chance against the US. And how popular is Maduro in Venezuela? Do you think this could work? Do you think that some in the Venezuelan army might change?
A lot of questions there, Angela. So let me address the first one. Maduro's not popular in Venezuela. There was an election last year that Maduro stole. International election observers and the opposition, which collected the individual tally sheets and the receipts printed out by the voting machines, demonstrated the opposition won close to 70% of the vote, and Nicolas Maduro only won about 30%. But he went on to declare his own victory. He never provided any evidence for those claims. So he's clearly unpopular. He's led the country into economic ruin. More than 8 million Venezuelans have fled the country. There is a deep problem right now of inflation approaching about 400% in the country. So he's not popular. The problem is what he's done over the last, several decades, including the time when his predecessor and mentor, Hugo Chavez, was in power, is effectively corrupt the military, is give the military access to many of the transit points in which cocaine passes over, give them access to favorable conditions on a currency exchange rate so they can engage in arbitrage to make money in imports. He's also granted other armed groups control over the rich gold mining area in the Orinoco, including the Colombian guerrilla group, the ELN. So what he's done is he's basically coup-proofed his government. He's implicated them in this entire corrupt scheme that he is running, along with Vladimiro Padrino, who you mentioned in your report too, and Diosdado Cabello. These guys are indeed deeply involved in narcotics trafficking and illicit activities, but they've implicated the military. So the military is unlikely to turn. They're also unlikely to turn because Maduro and Chavez before him have brought in Cuban spies who've deeply penetrated the entire intelligence sector and also the military, and they're keeping an eye on who expresses any dissent with this government. If you dissent with this government and you're in the military, you will have a very difficult time. This government not only jails those dissenters within the military, he also jails their families, and there's several dozen former military officers currently in political prison, and a number have been killed, and there are more in exile. So it's unlikely the military is going to turn on Maduro in this case. It's also, though, unlikely the U.S. Will intervene or invade Venezuela. It's a country of 28 million people, multiple urban centers, jungles, mountains, as well as a number of armed groups, including paramilitaries that are deeply loyal to Nicolas Maduro, the colectivos they're called. So they would face an uphill battle. The U.S. would probably win it. but it would be a difficult battle with multiple fronts to be fought and with multiple armed groups to confront. And as we know, Donald Trump doesn't have the stomach for what he denounced as forever wars in the 2016 campaign against Hillary Clinton then, and referring in particular to Iraq and Afghanistan. So I don't think the U.S. is about to invade. I think it may strike some targets safely from missiles and from the boats that are parked off the coast, but I don't see it invading. And the hope is by doing that, somehow it will spark some regime change that will remove Maduro from power and somehow lead to the opposition to take power. I think that latter part is highly unlikely. I just don't see that happening given the current array of characters you have in this government and given the deep corruption and weakness of the Venezuelan state.
The Colombian president, Gustavo Petro, has ordered that his people should suspend any intelligence sharing with Washington over this. Does the United States value their intelligence? We're also hearing unconfirmed reports that the UK has also said it might suspend intelligence sharing because it fears perhaps being involved in illegal operations. Is Trump bothered by that?
I doubt in the case of Colombia, Trump and the President Petro of Colombia have had a very public spat, including Gustavo Petro calling for Trump's ouster. Unclear how. So I don't think the Petro connection bothers him that much, although it is actually a loss for U.S. military intelligence. The U.S. has had a very deep security relationship with Colombia going back decades, in part because of the guerrilla insurgency that existed at the time in narcotics. So they are going to lose intelligence and a certain number of assets in Colombia, but symbolically it doesn't matter much to Trump. If indeed the case is true in the United Kingdom, we'll see, but it's certainly been alleged that they are going to suspend sharing intelligence with the United States and the Caribbean. And they have very good intelligence networks in the Caribbean, given their interests there and their presence in the Caribbean. Maybe, because we don't know. And the truth is that in many of these cases, the boats that you saw being bombed, we don't know whether they're carrying drugs. This is not a typical operation for drugs interdiction. Typically, the Coast Guard boards the boats, confirms that there are drugs there, and then arrests the people. But in this case, they're blown to smithereens and sink to the bottom of the ocean. So we don't know actually if they were carrying drugs, if they were serious narcotics traffickers, cartel members. So we don't know if UK intelligence played a role in that. But what we can say is if the UK is suspending its operations of intelligence sharing with the United States, it shows a huge amount of displeasure with the illegality of what the Donald Trump administration is doing right now, of labeling these people narco-terrorists and killing them in international waters without a trial, without any form of evidence, without any form of due process. Clearly, if the UK is doing this, it's sending a signal that it's willing to risk other elements of intelligence cooperation simply in the name of preserving international law and condemning the extrajudicial killing of suspects.
You've just outlined there all the ways in which it flouts international law. Trump operates on this very kind of approximate way of doing things very often. Is it working in terms of, do ordinary Americans think it's a good policy? And is it having any effect, even if, as you say, there's no evidence that actual drug traffickers are being eliminated? They might be, they might not be. But it's sending a signal, a wider signal. Is there any evidence that it's actually working and that drug trafficking is significantly diminishing?
So there are several questions there again, Angela. First of all, a majority of Americans do support these actions, but we have to recognize these are pretty cost-free actions. I mean, not cost-free to the taxpayers. It's estimated that sending the aircraft carrier costs about $8 million a day. And even before then, people were estimating it was close to several $1 million a day for the rest of the fleet, because there are now about 15,000 U.S. soldiers or naval officers and personnel off the coast of Venezuela. So it's not cost-free, but in this case, this doesn't represent a threat to U.S. lives. It doesn't represent a commitment to boots on the ground. And in that case, when you look at the numbers, although many Americans support the idea of these operations, they do deeply oppose. Only about 20%, a little over, close to 30, really support any sort of U.S. military action. So it's popular in the sense of as long as it remains cost-free, but very unpopular if there's going to be the commitment of troops. Now, has this stopped the flow of drugs? No. As I mentioned, this is really insignificant in the amount of drugs that flows to the United States. 5 to 8% of the drugs comes from Venezuela, mostly come by flying over Venezuela or stopping over briefly. Fentanyl is not produced in Venezuela. Most of the cocaine actually that's produced or flown over Venezuela is headed towards Europe and Western Africa. So again, this is, no pun intended, trumping up an excuse to basically try to threaten Maduro by alleging that somehow the Venezuelan government is complicit in killing American lives from overdoses. And by the way, most of the American lives that are killed by overdoses, tragically, about 80,000 last year, aren't killed by cocaine, they're killed by fentanyl. But fentanyl is not produced in Venezuela. So this is really an element of Trump trying to do two things: mobilize his base in support of defending America first, in this case from drugs, but then also trying to promote regime change to a regime that really has been an enemy for Donald Trump, even going back to his first term, when they created a parallel shadow government and nominated by the National Assembly a interim Democratic president, Juan Guaido, in the hope, again, in that case, that the military would defect and swing their support from Maduro to Juan Guaido. It didn't happen. This time, Donald Trump is bringing real weapons and real threats of intervention off the coast of Venezuela. We'll see if this works. It may, but I highly doubt it.
Really interesting. Christopher Sabatini, that's all we have time for, sadly. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us and your insights on this. Christopher Sabatini, there, Senior Research Fellow for Latin America on the US and the Americas programme at Chatham House think tank in London.